Okay, can you hear me? Great. So I am very, very pleased to introduce Jeremy Frank, a good friend who's been working in some place called NASA, I believe. And he's wanted to give some talk, which clearly is no reason for any hype around it, because it's just a run-of-the-mill rocket scientist talking about artificial intelligence. So presumably there's no real reason for any hype.
So why
he
are you
has
all here? What are you all doing?
he has tons and tons of very interesting stories about actual space missions that if you get a chance during the after the talk, you should ask him for some of those. Jeremy is the group lead of Planning and Scheduling Group at the Intelligent Systems Division at NASA AMES. He got his PhD at computer science in UC Davis in, I believe, '97, and a BA before that in Pomona College. His work involves development of automated planning and scheduling systems for use in space mission operations and the integration of technologies for planning, plan execution, and fault detection for space applications, and the development of technology to enable astronauts, real astronauts, to autonomously operate spacecraft. So nothing like the kind of stuff that we do every day ourselves. So Jeremy has published tons of scads of papers, conference papers, journal papers, book chapters, but the thing that is kind of particularly surprising to most of us would be that he apparently got 40 awards from NASA. I haven't got even one, he's got 40. So clearly he's done something very interesting for NASA, including Exceptional Achievement Medal, the Silver Snoopy. You got this, Snoopy? And the NASA Engineering and Safety Center Award. So he's going to talk to us today about artificial intelligence powering human exploration of the moon and Mars.
Well, we'll talk about the Snoopy later if you want to hear about that. So, am I pointing it the right way? Oh no, why is this not working? All right, well, we'll do it the old-fashioned way. So, maybe we're not going to do it at all.
Yeah, that's fine. Now it will work.
Ah, okay. So,
You may want to put the mic closer to you.
yeah, so I do have a tendency to wander, so if I wander too far from the mic, just let me know and I'll get back on track. This is a picture of Phobos. This picture was taken by the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter in 2008. Phobos is one of the two moons of Mars. The other moon's name is Deimos. And as partial motivation for this talk, imagine, if you will, that there is a spacecraft, a space station, sort of like the International Space Station, that is in orbit around Mars, possibly near to Phobos, and that there are human astronauts on this spacecraft who are exploring Mars. This would be, sort of the exploration achievement of anybody's lifetime. And what I'd really love to tell you is this is what NASA has in store, but alas, that's not exactly what we have in store. We have something almost as good planned. So many of you have seen, perhaps recently, that NASA has announced what's called the Artemis Program. This is a program which is going to send people back to the moon. The aspiration is that we're going to do this by 2024. And there are a variety of pieces of this plan that are being executed today. The first of these is what's called the Artemis 1 mission. You see that on the far left here. This is NASA's first human-rated spacecraft that we built since the end of the Space Shuttle program. This is going to be launched on a rocket called SLS. The first unmanned mission of Orion to the moon is slated to take place next year, with a human mission to go around the moon after that. This is sort of a retrospective mission for Apollo 8, for those of you who remember that. Rao might remember that. But after that, we also have a number of different robotic missions to the moon, including a variety of things that are being undertaken by a commercial sector. And all of this is going to culminate in a human landing on the moon by 2024. And so this is pretty exciting. And even though this isn't Mars, it's sort of this next stepping stone that NASA has on its way to Mars, because we're going to pioneer many of the things that we need to do in order to go to Mars as part of those missions. So, with that in mind, what I plan to do today is to give a talk about some of the work that NASA is doing in order to get us on the road to those missions to the moon and ultimately to Mars. So what I want to do first is I want to start with an overview of what it means to perform space mission operations, and in particular human spaceflight mission operations. And then that'll set the stage for us talking about the uses of artificial intelligence technology of a variety of different kinds in order to facilitate autonomous mission operations as opposed to what's done today, where these missions are primarily controlled by the control centers on Earth. I will then do a tour de force of AI technologies. There's a lot of different AI technologies more all the time. I won't be able to go through them completely, but I'll talk about planning, plan execution, and fault management. And then I'll talk about some other supporting technologies, including things like high-performance computing and machine learning, that are part of the technology story that we need in order to enable autonomy, but aren't strictly speaking core AI. Then the last thing I'll do is talk about some specific demonstrations of those technologies that NASA has done in the last really 6 or 7 years. We'll review 3 specific ones in detail, and then I'll sort of zoom out a little bit for some broad perspective at the end, and then we'll have some time for questions. Okay, so let's begin with mission operations, and in particular human spaceflight mission operations, although many of these things that we'll talk about are also very relevant to robotic missions. So in mission operations, traditionally in the human spaceflight world, they refer to this as the plan, train, fly cycle. What we're really going to talk about today is mostly what happens while spacecraft is in flight. We have people in the control center, and they're actually managing these missions hour by hour, day by day. And I'll talk about what some of those control center functions are in order to set the stage for what we need to migrate on board in order to enable this autonomous mission operations function. So the first 2 functions that we'll talk about monitoring first. So the purpose of monitoring is to figure out, what is my spacecraft doing? What is the state of my spacecraft? What is the state of all of its various subsystems? So our spacecraft have a variety of different sensors. They measure things like pressures, temperatures, flow rates. They measure the positions of various valves, whether power switches are closed or open, things like that. In human spaceflight, we also have a variety of pieces of information coming from the crew. The crew are wired up with various sensors to give us a sense of whether the crew is healthy or not. So this is all the information that comes from sensors. All of that information needs to be processed, abstracted, and then presented to mission control center operators in order to help them understand what's going on. So in the human spaceflight world, the information is typically grouped into what are called displays. Displays are both a combination of physical displays, individual computer screens, and logical displays that group relevant pieces of information together to give people a sense of what's going on. So to give one example of this, suppose that I'm a power systems flight controller. So I'm concerned with the state and configuration of the power system. I'm concerned with batteries. I'm concerned with my solar arrays, and so on and so forth. So that's my primary set of information. I group those things into displays, maybe battery by battery, power distribution box by power distribution box, and so on and so forth. If by contrast, I'm a mission operations planner who's concerned with what the crew is doing, I don't particularly care about the state of health of a particular battery. Instead, what I'm concerned with is, what's the crew doing? Are the crew doing what they're supposed to be doing? And if they're not doing that, what are they doing instead? So this is the kind of thing that we talk about when we talk about how to separate the information into these displays, right? In addition to being a function of what piece of hardware I'm interested in, these displays are also often grouped by what phase of the mission I'm in. So for instance, if I have astronauts who are going outside on an extravehicular activity, this is where they get their spacesuits on and go outside, they do that. So I may be concerned with certain pieces of information, and I may be less concerned with others. So what I see is a function of where I am in the mission. Okay. And so the whole point of all of this, it should be relatively straightforward. This is what I do as a flight controller in order to maintain situational awareness, understand the state of my system, make sure that plans are going the way that they're supposed to be going. So the next major function is planning and scheduling. So this is what I did for a living when I was a PhD student, and it's what Dr. Rao does and many of the students in his lab. So the purpose of this function is to ensure that I have a plan for all the major spacecraft subsystems in order to accomplish some set of objectives. So first of all, I need my objectives. What is it that I'm planning for, right? Am I planning to go outside? Am I planning to take a picture of something? What am I planning to do? But Our space missions are big and complex, as are many things, and so quite often what happens is that we have to build our plans many days to weeks ahead of time. For the International Space Station, I was describing this last night to some of the students, the sort of strategic plan for an International Space Station mission is usually generated about 6 months ahead of time. This is at the level of how much time astronauts and everybody else are going to spend doing certain classes of activity. A detailed, step-by-step, sort of 5-minute by 5-minute timeline for ISS activity is usually generated 2 weeks ahead of time. So if I have a plan that I'm responsible for managing today, that plan was frozen and set in stone 2 weeks ago. Okay? So on the day of execution, I don't want to be thinking about how to get everything done, right? I took care of all that a long time ago in the ISS world. The other thing that happens is that plans for each major spacecraft subsystem are developed separately, and then there's an integration activity. So that plan that was frozen 2 weeks ago was a plan that was assembled from the power plan, the attitude plan, the trajectory plan, the communication plan, the plan for what the crew is doing, the life support systems management plan. All those plans are created separately, and then they have to be integrated, glued together, and any discrepancies or constraint violations or anything like that, all that has to be ironed out. So there is not just one planning system, but several. They all have to come together in this integrated master plan. Raise your hands if this is a problem that you have personally experienced. Say, for instance, you have children. So, obviously, when the unexpected happens, we may have to replan. There are a variety of different unexpected events that can cause this to happen, some of which we will talk about here. Before we talk about that, we'll talk about execution. Planning is fine, and planning is very interesting, but plans aren't much good unless you actually perform those plans, right? Because otherwise, you build a plan, you don't do it, you don't actually get the benefit. So, in the robotic spacecraft world, performing a plan usually involves sending commands over some kind of electronic command and data interface to all the different subsystems. I'm going to open and close power switches. I'm going to command the solar arrays to rotate at a certain rate. I'm going to open a hatch, close a hatch, what have you. When the crew's involved, plan execution usually doesn't involve telling astronauts what to do, at least not in quite the same way, but you know that the crew is going to be performing these activities. And so a lot of the questions that surround this involve things like tracking what's supposed to happen next, making sure that it started on time, canceling activities that are problematic because you see something you don't like, an unexpected event or a fault, something like that, and sort of responding tactically to what happens as the plan unfolds. Which brings us to fault management. So this is a very broad subject and it encompasses a lot of different things, but fundamentally fault management starts with the question, has something gone wrong? Now, we distinguish between something has gone wrong from an unexpected event, right? Unexpected events aren't faults, but the first question to answer after something has gone wrong is to understand what went wrong. And then the next thing to worry about is what are the impacts of what has gone wrong. So an example that I often like to use is something has gone wrong and a light bulb on my spacecraft has gone out. Now, it could be that a light bulb going out is not terribly interesting to me. If it's a light bulb that is sort of a redundant light bulb and there are other light bulbs, then the impacts of this fault are sort of boring. By contrast, suppose that my solar arrays fell off. Okay, well this is a slightly more profound problem and I need to care a lot more about that because of the implications of the fault. So you can see that there's this minor but important difference between just figuring out what has happened and looking at the consequences. The consequences need to be understood in context. So obviously once we've had a fault, we have to figure out whether we need to change our plan. So if my plan is broken, now I have to have a new plan and so on and so forth. So these are the major 4 functions. There's a lot more that goes on in flight control. This is just a very, very brief look of some of the many things that happen. But this is the stuff that people are doing sort of day by day, minute by minute, hour by hour. Okay? So I have no doubt that people can understand that if these functions are being done on the ground, which they can be for the International Space Station, we can communicate with the International Space Station all the time. It's usually in communication. and the communication lifetime delay is very small. But when we have a spacecraft at Mars, this calculus changes completely. The one-way lifetime difference to Mars when it's on the opposite side of the sun from us is 22 minutes. 22 minutes. So if I have a problem that's unfolding quickly, I can't respond in anything less than 45 minutes. And that's assuming I immediately know what to do as soon as the information hits me, which I usually don't. So as we explore further and further away, we obviously have to change the equation. We have to move some of these functions that are done on board, on the ground, on board. So another thing that I will linger on briefly here is the difference between autonomy, which is a relative term that describes the relationship between two entities, and automation, which is not that. It is a property of a process. It is, nevertheless, something that people get confused by. I wish to point out that there is this thing called the dictionary, where we can look up words and define them, rather than invent new terms, which people seem to do, and it makes me kind of crazy, so we can skip over this. But the more interesting part is that in order to enable this autonomous mission operations type of work, we have to change the balance of responsibility between our control center and our vehicle, between our astronauts and our vehicle, and hopefully it's the work of a moment to see that AI is one way that we can start to do those kinds of things. So, are there any questions about any of that before we move on? Any quick questions? Anybody? No. Okay. So we'll talk about technologies. We'll start with planning. Excuse me. So the purpose of planning is to build a plan in order to accomplish a set of goals by choosing a set of activities to perform. Planning is related to, but not quite the same as scheduling. There's a big, long discussion about that. But scheduling can be thought of as ordering the activities that I have chosen in order to satisfy a variety of different kinds of constraints. So when we think about what those constraints are, I've got a list of them here. There are a variety of different classes of constraint that we may have to worry about. So there are a variety of constraints like absolute time constraints. So I want to take a picture of something, and I want to take a picture of it no earlier than 10 o'clock and no later than 10:30 because of the lighting conditions, right? Or some other quality of the picture that's satisfied only during those times. Ultimately, I may have a relative time constraint. I want to take a picture no less than 5 minutes after I reorient my spacecraft, because otherwise the spacecraft is vibrating, the image quality won't be that good. So that's a relative time constraint. There are a variety of different kinds of resources constraints, battery state of charge, mutual exclusion between activities that can't occur at exactly the same time for any one variety of reasons. So these are very familiar scheduling constraints. Planning constraints are a little bit different. That's what these precondition effects conditions are here. These are these more sort of causal constraints. I'm going to reconfigure the state of the system in order to achieve some objective. There's a subtle but interesting relationship between these two things, and for our purposes today, it's not terribly important. But when we think about the planning and scheduling task, this is the kind of thing that we have to worry about doing. So for plan execution or task execution, again, this is the function of carrying out the set of activities in the plan that I started with. And in particular, I'm not going to talk too much today about continuous control. That is not a subject that I'm an expert in. So we'll focus on the more discrete part of the task, task execution. And so the idea here is that I have this plan. This plan tells me what I'm doing. It tells me when I'm going to do it. Or it tells me the order in which I'm going to do these things. And it may have a variety of conditions that sort of elaborate on the fixed time schedule. And now what I need to do is I need to monitor the state of things, and I need to ask myself this constant set of questions. Is there a task that's ready to start? If I've started the task, how is it going? Are there things that I want to watch for in order to interrupt that task and stop it because something bad has happened? Are tasks needing to be halted, or do I get notifications that they're halted? And in particular, for unexpected events and faults, I may have contingencies, things like loops and branches that need to be evaluated. So when we talk about plan execution, this is what we're talking about. This is the set of things that have to be done. Okay. Last but not least of our enabling AI technologies is fault management. Many people don't consider fault management AI. I think they're mistaken. I consider it as part of our AI toolbox. And so, again, our first problem here is monitoring our set of systems to determine whether a fault is taking place. The next thing is to determine what fault is taking place if one has, isolate the fault if we can, and then assessing remaining capability. These are the things that we're on about here. Now, there are a number of other sort of related elements of fault management we'll get into. So the first one is anomaly detection or off-nominal detection. So an anomaly is the scenario in which a particular system isn't working the way that it usually works. So there's some fuzziness here, but the point is, anomalies are often an indicator of faults, but they're not quite the same thing. So anomaly detection and fault management need to be somewhat distinguished between. They're very useful. We'll see an example of this a little bit later in the talk. The other thing is that when we talk about the consequences of faults, the kinds of things that we're interested in are both loss of capabilities. So when I lost my light bulb, maybe I haven't lost capability at all. When I lost my solar arrays, I probably have lost capability, versus loss of redundancy. And in human spaceflight control, loss of redundancy is sometimes almost as bad as loss of capability. This can trigger conditions of changing my plan, coming home because I've lost critical redundancy. Those are the sorts of things that we're interested in. So we'll see some examples of how we technically address these things a little bit later. And other things that people are interested in are prognostics, trying to predict future failures, which probably should be on this list but is not. So one last point about fault isolation. Sometimes we may not be able to completely and totally isolate a fault. So the reason why this is interesting and important is because it could be that I've suffered a single fault and I don't know what fault it is, so I may have an ambiguity. But it could also be that I've suffered multiple faults. And so in the presence of ambiguity, trying to figure out what's going on is a little bit more interesting. Okay, so that's the core. What else do we have? So if we're building an autonomous system in order to help astronauts perform their job without the control center's help, we have to think about the human interface part of this problem. What is it that our astronauts want to see? If I have a piece of technology that builds a plan, how do I explain this plan to my astronauts? If I've diagnosed a fault, how do I help the astronauts understand what the fault is and what to do about it? So human factors engineering, user interface design, all of these things go into the task of designing good, effective user interfaces that make use of this technology. That's the sort of upward integration part of the story. The downward integration part of the story refers to the integration of this with flight software. So flight software can be thought of as sort of the operating system for my spacecraft. Our spacecraft fly processors that are several generations behind the processors that you are sitting with in the audience here, whether it's in your pocket or whether it's your laptop computer. The software support for these radiation-tolerant and radiation-hardened processors is also very, very immature compared to what it is that we have at our disposal on our desktop computers today. There are things like, there are flight software coding standards that, for instance, forbid you from allocating memory using pointers. You need predictability in the total amount of memory and runtime that your processes use. Raise your hands if you know how long your planner takes to run on any problem that you throw at it. Yeah, neither do I. So these things are all challenges when we think about integrating our AI technology with flight software. And if we're going to make our spacecraft into autonomous spacecraft, that's what we have to do. These are very difficult problems to solve. Now, even though the current generation of radiation-tolerant and radiation-hardened processors is very bad, there is cool stuff happening. DARPA, DoD, and NASA are collaborating on some new exciting space-based high-performance computing, which we hope is going to solve some of those problems, although it's probably not going to solve them all. But suffice it to say that we need to think hard about what we can and cannot take advantage of in terms of high-performance computing for future spaceflight. So last but not least, let's talk about my favorite subject, machine learning. It's only because I'm jealous of all the attention that Yama Kuhn and Gary Marcus get. Anyway, so machine learning. What about machine learning? So we're going to talk a little about machine learning as one of the applications, but one of the questions that I sometimes get is, are we going to have our spacecraft learn? And today my answer is no, we're not going to have our spacecraft learn on board our spacecraft. Why is that? Well, first and foremost, there's the question of, if I see some new piece of information that I want to learn, is this a transient or is it a permanent? Do I understand how to incorporate this as an example of something into my learned whatever it is? So the usual answer is the spacecraft doesn't know. Only a human expert can really judge what to do with a particular new example or whether to fold it back into your learning system. And second, like we just talked about, our processors are very limited, so I don't want to waste that processing power learning. So today, for human spaceflight, my answer to this question is we want to send that data back to Earth. We want to then curate that data, figure out how to incorporate it into our learned system. But that doesn't mean we're not going to exploit learning, it's just we're not going to exploit it on board. So that's part of why I consider this sort of an associated technology as opposed to one of the core elements. Okay. So this is a computer science audience and a computer science talk, or at least many of you are. So let's talk about computational complexity. So we had some words earlier about the limitations of the processing power that we have at our disposal in order to solve these problems. And many of the algorithms that are going to satisfy our operational needs are very computationally intensive, they may be memory intensive, quite apart and above and beyond the sort of system engineering and software design part of the problem. We just have to deal with this complexity question. Even tractable algorithms may be very expensive because of the scale at which they need to be run. So what do we do about that? Well, really the main message is that software has mass because of the onboard resources that are required in order to support those algorithms, and we just need to be mindful of this as we try and deploy these things in these operational environments. Are there any questions about any of that before we move on to the fun stuff, the war stories? Yes?
You mentioned that there's a need as we go further into space. Is there a difference between the test data and the training data out in the further regions of space versus the test data that you're gathering for the Artemis mission to the moon?
Yeah, so the question was, as we are further and further from Earth, are the kinds of tests and test data that we have, are they going to change? The answer is absolutely. So the best example that I can give of this is the radiation environment. The radiation environment near Earth is relatively benign. Once you get above a certain altitude, you lose the protection of the atmosphere, but you have the protection of the magnetosphere. Once you leave the magnetosphere, the radiation environment is much more hostile. So we know something about that from the various Mars missions that we've flown and the various other missions to the outer planets, but we don't have nearly as much of that data as we do for low Earth orbiting missions. And so that's exactly the kind of difference in operating environment that we have, and it's one of those big risk factors, right? We just don't know what we don't know yet. So yeah, that's just one of many examples of that sort of thing. Any other questions?
Do the ship really carry like multiple CPUs or multiple
Yeah, so the question was, aren't there multiple processors on board our spacecraft? The answer is depends. So for the International Space Station, the answer is yes, there are many processors on board the ISS, so if one of them fails, you have some left. But if you take a look at even Curiosity, the Mars rover, one CPU. If it's done, you're done. All right, yeah, all the way in the back.
Is power currently a limiting factor in how much computation power we install on like orbiters and different kinds of spacecraft missions?
So the question, yeah, so the question was, is power a limiting factor, power and energy? And the answer is yes. So remember, the solar flux goes down as the inverse of radius squared, right? So you can do solar in low Earth orbit. It's possible, but not great at Mars. It is not possible at Pluto. You cannot have a solar-powered mission that's of any use really effectively at Pluto. Well, Voyager notwithstanding. So radiation, radiothermals, nukes. Really, if we want to go to the far reaches of the solar system, we really have to think hard about what to do with nuclear power. That is obviously very problematic. There are both international treaties that constrain what can and cannot be done in space. There are practical considerations that the technology is not what it should be or could be. For low Earth orbit and moon, we're pretty power rich. on a big human spacecraft. On a small, cheap rover, not so much. So it's definitely a problem, and power-aware computing is definitely one of the partial solutions to that problem. But you know, it sort of varies mission by mission. Yeah, one last question, and then we'll go on.
Just for context on that, when you say power-rich, what do you mean? Because as a planetary scientist, I think about instruments being powered on milliwatts.
Right, well, so to put this in context, every solar array of the ISS is the size of a 777 wing. They got a lot of power. Do they have power to do everything that they want? No. So you still need to manage power. But, and so reduction in power, power-aware electronics, minimization of power consumption, it's still a thing for our human spacecraft, not the least of which because of the launch mass and launch volume proposition, right? So I'm not suggesting for a moment it's a solved problem, but to put this into perspective, right, if I'm looking at a communication satellite in GEO, those are pretty power rich, but they're consuming giant amounts of power. The low Earth orbiting observation satellites that we have are relatively power rich, except for things like synthetic aperture radar, so it's all a balance. But yeah, it's not a solved problem. All right. Okay, so let's go on. So what we'll do for the rest of the talk is talk about these three particular human spaceflight autonomy demonstrations that NASA has done. And without further ado, we'll just get started, and we'll go into the first one. So what we have here on the right side of the screen, this is called an express rack. Express stands for expediting the processing of experiments on board space station. This is a facility that, one of several facilities that is built into the ISS. And these facilities were designed to make it easy for physical and biological scientists to build experiments that can then be relatively easily integrated with the International Space Station. So if you see this part of the express rack, this is an experiment drawer, so it's like maybe this big. It's basically a sort of physical and logical form factor that you can use to design an experiment. The rack itself provides power, thermal, communication, fire suppression, and a couple of other different ISS services. The interface that the scientist now needs to deal with is relatively simple, comparatively speaking. But in order to make this happen, now some human being or set of human beings on Earth need to operate this express rack facility. They need to turn it on, they need to turn it off, they need to watch it, monitor it. Experiments get changed in and changed out. So that is a job for a flight controller to do. Okay? For us, on the project that I manage, we used it as a proxy for other kinds of systems that the crew would need to operate by themselves in the absence of mission control. So what we did first was we asked ourselves, what would it take to power up and configure an express rack that was turned off? So there's a piece of software on board the International Space Station called Timeliner that was developed by Draper Labs. You can think of it as sort of a combination of flight software integration environment and scripting language, and it allows you to basically write automation and scripts that allow you to do these kinds of things. So the power up and configuration of an express rack takes 3 flight controllers something like 45 minutes to do on Earth today. So the first thing we did was we worked with the owners of the express rack, and we wrote some Timeliner to automatically, at the issuance of the single command, to automatically power up and configure an express rack. So we did that first, and that worked. The next thing we did was we built a crew monitoring and decision support interface to allow a crew person to both initiate the power up command and then monitor the execution of the activity to make sure it did what it was supposed to do. This is that interface. Isn't it beautiful? No, it's awful, but this is what they want. So I'm going to walk through a couple of pieces of this. So the stuff here on the bottom and the stuff here on the right, these are all the low-level messages that describe all the low-level activity, the individual commands that are being issued by the scripts, the individual state of all of the rack systems, and all that other stuff. What's in the middle here is the sort of high-level abstract steps that are being executed. And what we see on the top, this is what's been done, this is what's being done now, this is what's coming in the future. The stuff in the ovals here, these are the pieces of data that pertain to the next command that is going to be issued. And what you can do is ask, you can answer the question, is that data in the right configuration for that next command to be issued or not? So you can sort of look into the future and say, things are going well, the next commands are going to be issued fine, or they're not going well, and this thing is not going to be issued, and I'm coming up on it, what's going on? So this was our first demonstration that I'll talk about today. And this demonstration was interesting because it blended some of the sort of system automation and some of the human factors and crew decision support types of enabling technology that I talked about. This demonstration was mostly pretty successful. We learned quite a lot from it. This is Jeff Williams, who is an ISS US astronaut, and he is taking this picture here. He's actually performing the power up and configuration activity. You can see much more clearly back here, this is actually one of the crew's laptop computers showing his daily activity plan and all the things that he has to do that day. That gray blob in the middle that you can't see, that's our interface, which is most unfortunate, but suffice it to say that he actually used it and we got some feedback on it, and it was very interesting. We learned a lot. And we had so much fun doing this that we're doing it again, which is to say we learned how we didn't do it right the last time, and we're trying again. All right. The second one that I'm going to talk about is called Advanced Caution and Warning System, or ACAWS. So ACAWS is primarily a series of demonstrations of fault management technology. This has actually been done mostly in the context of Orion. Orion, you may remember from the first couple of slides, this is the next spacecraft that NASA's building that hopefully is going to go take astronauts to the moon and back. So we pioneered ACAWS during a test flight in 2014, at the end of 2014. We matured this technology and demonstrated it using flight controllers who are receiving the same data stream that the flight controllers who actually conducted the test received. But we were primarily looking for spacecraft-wide faults. We were doing the fault detection and fault identification part of the problem. And again, we were looking to do this loss of capability and loss of redundancy detection. And since then, we've been doing some other things with this technology that I'll describe in a little bit. So before I get into what the application is, I'm going to spend some time describing the technology that we're using to solve this particular problem. So we're using something called TEAMS. TEAMS stands for Testability Engineering Analysis and Maintenance Systems. It is the result of, it's the product of a company called Qualtech Systems, which is based in Connecticut. And the way that TEAMS works is as follows. What we have is we have a component interconnection model of our spacecraft. Each component then has associated with it capabilities that it provides to other components, and it has a variety of operating modes, including fault modes. We also have associated with this model a series of logical tests, and the word logical is important, as we'll see in just a minute. These aren't physical sensors and tests, these are logical tests. What a logical test does is it provides you insight into whether or not some upstream component of that test has suffered a fault. So the fault results that you get from the tests are pass-fail, unknowns are treated too, but I'm not going to talk about those today. So the idea is that if a test fails, you know that some component upstream of you has suffered a fault, but you're not necessarily sure which one. If a test passes, what you know is that no component downstream of you has suffered any of the faults that that test informs you about. And if you combine test pass-fail results with a relatively straightforward reasoning axiom, what you can do then is take a set of test pass-fail results and you can infer what faults must have taken place. So to give you a concrete example, let's suppose that my spacecraft is really simple. I only have 3 components. I have a power supply. That power supply supplies a switch, which is part of my power distribution system. And there is exactly one load attached to the switch. It's a pump. Okay? What I have down here is I have a description of what faults each of those logical tests that I have here inform me about. So the most discriminating test is this one. This test tells me whether the power supply has failed. And it doesn't tell me anything else. It's very discriminating, and that's great. This test is almost completely and totally useless. because if it fails, then I know that any one of the components downstream of it failed, so that's not terribly helpful. And then the last test is somewhat discriminating. It can tell me the power supply failed, or it can tell me that the switch failed, but it doesn't tell me anything about the pump. So let's take an example test pass-fail result. So what do I see? I see the pump rotation test failed, the other two tests pass. So you can probably see where this is going at this point. The first thing that I know is that because the power supply test passed, I know that the power supply could not possibly have failed. Why? Because the test pass exonerates all of those failures that I hear about. So this is a great thing because it allows me to roll a bunch of stuff out. The next thing that I'll investigate is the PDU-RTC power test. So in conjunction with the other test pass, that exonerates the power distribution system failure. So the only test left is the pump rotation test, but I wrote out the other two faults, and this means that the thing that must have gone wrong is the pump. That's the way Teams works. Now, this is great, or at least it seems great, but there's a bunch of stuff that's hiding in here, as we will soon see. So, to get into the computer science of this a tiny bit more, that matrix that I had at the bottom right there, that's called the diagnostic matrix, or the D matrix. It has one row per failure mode, one column per test, and it identifies which tests pass and fail. So, so it's actually very tractable. Given the diagnostic matrix and given a particular test pass fail result, it's pretty easy to figure out what the conclusions that I can draw are. I basically sort the test into passes and fails. For each pass test, put anything that's exonerated on the good list. For any failure, put any unexonerated test on the bad list. The bad list that I have at the end is the set of fault candidates. If there's one and only one, I have successfully diagnosed and isolated the fault. If there's more than one, I either have multiple faults or I have an ambiguity. Now, from a computer science point of view, that looks great. It's only quadratic. That's fine. Well, what if I have 10,000 tests? Uh-oh. So, all is not beer and Skittles here. Now, let's look at this consequence assessment part of the problem next. So what we've now talked about is how it is that I isolate faults. How do I look at loss of capability and loss of redundancy? So we can basically take the same kind of model that we had, but now we reason about our faults in a slightly different way. So if I have a slightly more sophisticated problem now, now I have two power strings that feed my power distribution unit, and I've got the pump at the end. So if I've lost one of the two batteries, so the battery's gone, well, I can lose the power controller as a result of having lost the battery, but what I can conclude now is that I'm one of the two redundant strings down on the power distribution unit and the pump, because the other string is still good. What does this make you think of? It makes you think of high-connected components in graphs, and that's exactly what it is. So, without walking through all of the words on the slide, effectively what we do is treat the interconnected component graph as though it were an abstract graph. Every time I determine that I have a fault, what I can now do is basically take out all the components left, and I can ask, have I taken a biconnected component and turned it into a singly connected component? This is very, very straightforward. It uses depth-first search. Depth-first search is tractable. I can do this once per capability in my system, and now I have an algorithm for computing loss of capability and loss of redundancy. Now again, from the computer science perspective, this looks good, but what if these graphs are huge? We'll see how huge they can look in a little bit, but thousands of faults, thousands of components, thousands of tests. This starts to get a little bit tricky in my embedded processor, which is where I really want to run this, right? So it turns out that there are some very, very interesting algorithms that are in the literature that do biconnected component analysis. This one that I've quoted here is from Henziger. So I can do incremental complexity of n to the 2/3, where n is the number of edges in my graph. So if I have a sparse graph and I only have to do this every so often, this is a hell of a lot better than doing it all up front every single time, so why would I do that? Furthermore, querying is constant time. That's great. How memory expensive is it? I have no idea. But you can see that there are some interesting tricks that one can play in order to make this kind of thing go better. Okay, so people are walking out, so I have to start doing more exciting things. I know people have places to go, don't worry about it. So what do we do with this? Why are we doing this in the first place? Well, so as I said, the whole point is to do this for Orion. Orion is a crewed spacecraft. It's a capsule design, so it's sort of an Apollo-like design. And what's been happening over the course of many, many years is that NASA is both working on the physical and logical displays, or whatever displays, that the astronauts are going to use in order to fly this vehicle. So long in advance, they set up what's called the Rapid Prototyping Lab. So this is a way where they started putting together designs of the hardware, the edge keys, the joysticks that the crew is going to use. They're practicing protocols, they're running through failure cases, all in an intent to sort of get out in front of the real vehicle design so that by the time we get to fly it, we actually know what it is that we're flying. So we've been very fortunate. We've been working with the astronaut office in the Rapid Prototyping Lab, and we've been participating in many of their mini simulations, as they call them. So we have a room where the astronauts sit in sort of a version of Orion, and we have a small control center like this one. This is sort of an older picture of the control center. But what we do is we develop the fault cases that are used in the simulation for the astronauts in order to evaluate their displays, many of which have nothing to do with our fault management displays. But we also get to develop and test our fault management algorithms, both for flight controllers, as we see here, on an embedded hardware board in order to do things like measure performance and understand the limitations of our software. But sometimes we have imposters who sit in the back of the room. We're not totally sure how those people got there. It's very embarrassing, so these things have to be dealt with. So, but this is the purpose to which we're putting this. And so we would like to ultimately think about how to take this technology and actually deploy it on Orion. It's a big push. The Orion avionics is very constrained. The software is very complex. But it's also a good test case for some other uses, for example, the Human Habitable Gateway spacecraft that we saw at the very, very beginning. Okay, last war story, and then we'll get to the reception and maybe some questions. So, the last demonstration I'm going to talk about is called the TOCA SSE experiment. So this is a picture of TOCA. TOCA is called the Total Organic Carbon Analyzer. This is a water quality analysis system. It's one of several redundant water quality analysis systems on board the space station, and it's used to test water quality and make sure that the water is actually safe to drink. So this is the potable water display tester. SSEs, these are the station support computer laptops. You see astronaut Daniel Taney, retired astronaut, when he was on board the station. Excuse me, he is surrounded by a bunch of SSCs which look like they're about to attack him. There's something like 30 SSCs on board the station. They're distributed all over the place. They're used in order to do a variety of very important functions for the crew. Each crew person has one assigned to them to read their email, and it's their personal device that they can use to do whatever they want. The crew reads their daily plan, they refer to their procedures, and a variety of other things. So they're critical pieces of equipment, and they need to be managed. So if we look at these two pieces of equipment as things that the crew would need to manage autonomously, what's involved here? So water quality samples are taken once or twice a week, sometimes 3 times a week. There are a variety of maintenance activities that the crew need to perform in order to make sure that the TOCA is operating properly. And the TOCA fails, and we'll see some of those failure modes in a little bit. Laptops, we all know what happens to our computers, right? They overheat, their disks get full, they need to be vacuumed, any one of a number of things, and so they also need to be managed on a regular basis. So, our crew demonstration experiment here was to look at the planning function, the monitoring function, and some of the fault management functions, a little bit less extreme than what we just saw for Orion. There was no execution that we tested for this. So, just to give you a sense of some of the complexities of actually flying software on board the ISS, this is a fairly gross, abstract schematic of our software deployment environment. So if you imagine the crew using their personal devices, either their SSCs or something like an iPad up here, those things communicate either wired or wirelessly to a server much like servers in terrestrial network environments. That server then has our software living in a virtual machine, which is basically fronting for a web service. So I'm constantly tickled by the fact that basically what we did was we wrote a web application and flew it on board the ISS. It wasn't the first. They've actually flown some very sophisticated web apps. But that was sort of interesting. And then the virtual machine actually communicates either with each individual station support computer laptop that dumps data into a database, or the token device, which basically generates output that gets transferred to a file system. So I'll walk through the key components of the software design, and then I'll show you how it all fits together. So first and foremost is a function which we call the monitor. So you can think of the monitor as sort of the lizard brain of our software. Essentially, it's watching for key events, and it's responding to those key events by invoking other functions. The first thing that it does is it watches for new TOCA sample files. It also watches for a clock signal in order to draw data from the SSE laptop database and perform analysis on it. It also performs functions like marshalling a bunch of logs, both logs of performance and housekeeping logs, to send to the ground. It also is watching processes to see if they went rogue, and it issues a kill signal if things went on for too long. The first sort of interesting AI function we'll talk about is our scheduler. So as scheduling problems go, this one was very, very straightforward. So you can see the activities that we had to schedule and their frequency constraints. So this is a cyclic problem, and it's also a relatively simple one in some respects. But what's interesting about it, if you look at it, is that the schedule frequencies are both a function of calendar time and also number of times that the device was used. So there's some sort of interesting things that are going on here, but fundamentally, schedule generation is a dispatch problem. I can look at the history of executed tasks, I can look at these schedule frequencies, and it's a polynomial time algorithm to spit out the things that we're supposed to do next. So from that point of view, it's fairly straightforward. The next thing about scheduling that's a little bit interesting is the crew interface. So the schedule horizon for our activities was 2 weeks out, plus the current week. So that's consistent with the ISS schedule. And so the recommended tasks here are the ones that the scheduler says, in the third week, these are the things that the scheduler thinks need to be performed. The crew could then decide to request one of those activities or not at their discretion. They could add other activities if they wanted to. If the schedulers decided that that was the right thing to do, they would then make the thing a scheduled activity. So you can see there's this back and forth with the ground in order to make sure that what the crew predicts and what we predict we're supposed to do is what actually gets done. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And so that's the way that the scheduler interacts with everything. The middle column here is a link to the detailed activity procedure that the crew would use in order to do the analysis for the maintenance activity. That's another web-based tool. It's a very mature web-based tool that the station program's been using for a very long time. Because we're a web app and they're a web app, we just needed the URLs of each of those things, so the crew could just click a button and it brings up the other tool with their procedure, which is very nice. And then the last column here on the right, this is the schedule rationale. Why does this activity need to be done? Basically, it's what's the schedule frequency, and it's not much more than that. The next piece of interesting AI is an anomaly detection system. See, I told you we talked about machine learning. So the inductive monitoring system is basically a clustering tool that was developed at NASA Ames quite a long time ago. What we did was we clustered nominal token data and used it to build a nominal performance profile. We can then compare what happens with a particular token sample to the nominal performance profile and see if things look a little weird. So, some of the challenges that we had, I'll just go ahead and click to the next slide because it's much more interesting than reading the words. These are all the different processing phases that a token sample goes through. There's enough water put into the token device in order to run each sample 3 times. So that meant that there were a lot of different transient behaviors that had to be dealt with when we did this anomaly detection task. This is the total inorganic carbon phase of TOCA, and you can see this red line is sort of the limit of nominal performance, and there are a couple data points above the red line for this particular sample. So we called this one OK. we called that one not okay. So there's still a lot more art than science to this anomaly detection game. And these are some of the reasons why. The second fault management technology we used for this demonstration was called the hybrid diagnosis engine, or HYDE. HYDE is not quite the same kind of fault management technology as Teams, but it does the same job. Its job is to do fault detection and fault isolation. The way that HYDE works is that you build a state machine model that describes the way that a particular device works. There are state transitions that respond to either events or commands or faults. You then monitor the performance of your device, and if you see a state transition that is not normal, what HYDE does is it does a search over the possible faults that could lead you to that faulty behavior. That turns out to be combinatorial, which is unfortunate, but it's very powerful compared to Teams in a variety of ways. So you see here the set of faults that we're working on. The one that we're most interested in that our flight controller colleagues wanted us to take a look at was this underfilled sample bag fault. So you remember I mentioned that sometimes the crew had to take these water samples from a little plastic bag. Can you believe that? Crew time to fill a little plastic bag filled with water. This is true. This is what they do. So you can underfill the bag. That's fundamentally the problem. And if you don't fill the bag with quite enough water, then TOCA may not have enough water to do all three of its samples. And if that happens, then first of all, you don't get a good sample, and second of all, the device actually has to be recovered by means of a repressurization operation that has to be issued by the ground. So if you put those two things together, this is the interface that we presented to the crew that helped them understand what happens after a TOCA sample was performed. So first and foremost, you get a report of what the water quality was, in which case, this case it's 0, so that should be an indication that something went wrong. The next thing that you see is you see the fault management hybrid diagnosis output. So in this case, it tells you off nominal. It's not green, which is an indication that something went wrong. It then says, oh yes, the sample bag has run out of water. The next thing that it does is provides the crew with instructions on what to do. This was very important. During our user interface tests, during our crew subject tests, we heard over and over and over, the crew didn't want to be told sort of, what we think is going on. No. What they wanted to be told was, what do I do about this? Do I have to do something? And what should I do? So, in part, this is a human factors question, right? What does the user want out of your technology? And the next question is, well, how do you give it to them, right? So, human performance and human subject tests and good human factors engineering was really critical, along with involvement of our hardware experts, in order to get the right information into the crew's hands to tell them what to do. Now, the other thing that you see is the anomaly detection output. So in this case, there were no anomalies reported. Well, if the sample bag ran out of water, why isn't there an anomaly? We can talk about that offline. But suffice it to say that the relative coverage of these tools was very interesting, as we found out on orbit, and we learned a great deal. And unfortunately, we actually fielded a piece of technology and flew it with a grammatical error. Even after hours and hours and hours of testing, nobody caught this until I wrote the paper. Okay. Ooh, we're almost out of time. So I'm just going to skip over the SSE stuff because it wasn't all that interesting anyway. So if we now look at the software architectures, here are all of our various components. Here's a flow of how it all fits together. So you see a TOCA sample. The monitor says, I detected your TOCA sample. So I run the anomaly detector. I run the fault management system. We log some JSON. We built a web app. So this is the dynamically generated web content. So the next time the crew fires up their browser, they've got all the information at their disposal, and they know what to do. So we started building this in October of 2014. I'm sorry, in June of 2014. We deployed on ISS in August of 2014. We were up there for 7 months. We processed almost 60 TOCA samples. The crew used the software dozens of times. We got a lot of great information out of them. Unfortunately, they didn't use the SSE application, so that's why I'm not talking about it that much. But if you look at our scorecard, we didn't do too badly. And we had some problems, and some of those were our fault, and some of them were not. And we learned some great lessons. I can talk some more about those at the very end here. So this is Reed Wiseman, who's a US astronaut. You can see that he's actually floating above of the TOCA hardware. There's the little TOCA symbol. He's using the application on an iPad, one of the earliest instances of the crew doing these kinds of things on an iPad. This is European Space Agency astronaut Alex Gerst floating upside down behind him. We didn't take this picture in the Vomit Comet. This came from station. It was a really great picture to see. Okay. I know we're running a little bit behind, but I did want to take some time to do some broader perspective. So these three demonstrations and a number of others are among the kinds of these crew autonomy demonstrations that we've been doing over the last several years. And what I wanted to do now is sort of take the perspective, both as a computer scientist, but also as sort of a systems engineer from the NASA point of view. So just how far have we come? How much of the problem have we, quote unquote, tried to solve, let alone actually solve? So one thing that should be pretty plain is that we've only been able to look at using these technologies for a very small number of all the spacecraft subsystems. But notwithstanding, we've actually tried most of the AI techniques that I talked about at the very beginning, at least a couple of times. But let's look at the scaling part of the story. So this shows the various types of applications, some of which I was, of course, unable to talk about. But I want to draw your attention first to Orion ACOS, as we tested it in the control center, and then looking at it as sort of a vehicle system management, spacecraft as a robot application. So we're scaling pretty well compared to the size of a real vehicle here, 5,000 faults, 5,000 pieces of information, 5,000-ish components. We think that Orion ultimately is going to have about 15,000, so we're getting there. The International Space Station has 180,000 pieces of information that the US segment alone, minus payloads, sends to the ground every day. Let that sink in for a minute. We're going to put that on an embedded processor? I don't think so. Now look at everything else. Dozens, up to 100. So, we still have a long way to go on the scalability story. So we'll just pause and think about that. Okay. So these are just some of the investments that we're making in this kind of autonomy enabling technology. There are a great many others that obviously I don't have time to talk about, some being done by various other groups. But the point is that making these investments now means that ultimately we think we might be able to start fielding these things on our way to Mars. Perhaps we don't need them at the moon. We can start trying some of them out at the moon. But there are plenty of problems that remain. Scalability is an obvious one. We've only started thinking about how to get these things really integrated the right way. And so there's plenty more work for you all to do. So I want to make it clear that this work was done by a very large, very diverse, very talented team of people from across 3 NASA centers, NASA Johnson Space Center, Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama, and NASA Ames Research Center. These are the people who get all the great work done. There are a variety of publications about each of these demonstrations that I described. There's some descriptions of the supporting technology. And I think with that, we'll go ahead and wrap it up and take some more questions. Thank you.
For all the technologies that you've described, are they used by crew members from other nationalities for the ISS? And if so, how do you prevent proprietary or government-sensitive data that NASA wants?
Yeah, so we usually do these things for what are called USOS astronauts only. That's US crew, some European crew. Generally speaking, we don't work with the Japanese or the Russians. Samantha Cristoforetti used one of our systems. She's a European Space Agency astronaut. Unfortunately, Alex Gerst was not able to use our tool because it broke on orbit, which I'll tell you about later. The general rule is that the international partners more or less have an agreement about the technology that's on board ISS. So in order to deploy the technology on ISS, there are usually no constraints. In order to publicize anything about the technology, what we need to do is explain what it is that we are and aren't going to say. It goes through an export control process where we ask, what is this? Is this really something that we can talk about? So for instance, the details of the total organic carbon analyzer, they're public domain, so I can freely describe what it is and how it works, which is why I can actually tell you all about it. Yeah.
What role will the deep space network play in future autonomous missions as well as more advanced human spaceflight exploration? Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear the
Sorry,
question. Can you do it again?
What role will the deep space network play in more advanced autonomous mission operations?
Well, so even if we have a fully autonomous spacecraft at Mars, the kinds of things that I talked about are going to solve problems on the sort of day, but the problem of the couple of days, week, month, we're still going to be downlinking data from our spacecraft multiple times a day if we can. Can you imagine a flagship mission to Mars where we're not talking to it multiple times a day? That's just not going to happen. So we still need the DSN. We still need to increase the capacity of the DSN in order to keep communicating with those spacecraft. That's just not going away. Anybody else? Yes.
If you're talking about humans and Mars, you've got to be thinking 10 or 20 years out, right? DARPA is very interested in mind-machine interfaces, especially as regards human brains to AI's direct connection. They frequently call these hybrids centaurs. Is that on your screen, the idea of a direct connect between the human brain to AIs?
So, bluntly, no. I'll relay a conversation that I had with a colleague of mine in the astronaut office. So, I keep going on about all these things that I think that we can do. And at some point you ask yourself, well, are astronauts actually going to use this? And so Stan Love, my colleague in the astronaut office, said, really practically speaking, even today, as a crew person who's flown in space and has suffered space brain, I would trust myself to operate, say, the space station robotic arm over some piece of software. And I said, Stan, what the heck are you talking about? How can you say that? And he said, well, listen, if my computer suffers a radiation strike, and there's either a transient or permanent fault at the wrong time, and the arm goes out of control and it collides with something, that's just a risk that I'm not willing to take. All the stuff that I talk about is considered future wear. So if that's considered future wear, direct brain interfaces are future wear to the future wear. So we still have a long way to go for even these things to be considered at all trustworthy. And Stan's not wrong, right? We see even the rad-tolerant, rad-hardened computers on station suffering from rad strikes and doing all sorts of terrible things, even now. So I'm not saying he's totally wrong. I obviously have a slightly different perspective. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. I think those conversations just put into sharp focus how much work we all have in order to make these things work. And we're not even talking about software defect problems, right? We can hardly write software that works today, let alone writing AI software that works. So we got a long way to go on a lot of fronts before any of this stuff becomes real. Yeah?
Would you envision someday your work will be so advanced that you can replace astronauts?
No. I don't think that's the right way to think about it. This isn't Go. This isn't AlphaGo or AlphaZero. These problems are a lot harder than AlphaGo, AlphaZero, right? But I also think it's inappropriate because we don't have to do it for human computer systems in space. Now, if we're talking about a completely robotic system in space, that's a little bit of a different story. But even so, remember what I said, even at Mars, it's only 40 minutes round trip. So it's not like I have to send the thing out into the never, never, and never talk to it for 5 years until it comes back. This isn't V'ger either. So the best way to think about it is to ask, of all the systems that I can put at my disposal in order to make the mission a success, what combination of hardware, software, and people do I need in order to get the job done? Was there a question here? No. Yeah, go ahead.
So jumping off of that, I think you just sort of casually mentioned, we envision these sort of things for robotic missions. So what do you envision for robotic interplanetary spacecraft? And specifically right now, there's a lot of stuff thinking about rover navigation, but for things like orbiters or flyby spacecraft, what do you envision being the utility for autonomous
Yeah, so I think it's very important to recognize that the kinds of decision-making and reasoning that we need are going to differ greatly based on the mission context. So a rover, in many ways, a rover is actually in a very benign operating environment. If I have a problem with my rover, I can sit there and do nothing and stay power positive for a really long time. Not forever, but a really long time. It's very safe. If I'm doing a critical maneuver like Saturn orbit insertion or a flyby, I gotta get that right, because I've got one chance, exactly one. Am I gonna put an AI planner in charge of that? I'm gonna plan that to the nines, like we did for Pluto flyby, or for the Philae lander. Now, I can do all sorts of cool things to make sure that that sequence that I execute is as solid as it possibly can be, weeks, months ahead of time, not in the moment. For other things, well, it's a little bit more interesting, right? So let's think about, say, a UAV. So a UAV is not in a benign environment. It's got to keep moving, otherwise it's going to fall out of the sky. However, I can think while I'm flying. I can look into the future, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes. So, you know, the story varies a lot, and I don't think that there's any one answer. I get super frustrated when I talk to people at NASA headquarters who say, we're going to solve the autonomy problem, and I tell them, no, you're not. No, you're not. You have a toolbox. You need to think about what your mission is. You need to look at the tools in the toolbox, and you need to ask yourself, where, for this particular mission, do I have a technology gap? But it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Things like, you know, opportunistic science, you know, observations of opportunity, those are a completely different proposition than hazard avoidance while driving. One of them is mission critical. The other one, forgive me, is merely science efficiency. So I can afford to take a few more risks for science efficiency. But if I drive the rover off a cliff, that's it, game over. Yes?
Very nice talk. I'd like to hear about Snoopy, but before that,
Snoopy, yeah.
Astronauts train in simulators, I guess. And how close are simulators to the actual operational environment?
So they vary a lot. The training facilities are many and varied. They train in all kinds of different training facilities. Some of them are basically just, you know, computers with software on them. Some of them are quasi-immersive environments. They make extensive use of virtual reality and augmented reality for training. Some of them are physical simulators. For instance, there are special aircraft that are used to simulate the shuttle, which of course we don't have anymore. Extravehicular activity is trained in the Neutral Buoyancy Lab, which is the world's most big swimming pool in the universe. I heard some very interesting stories about NBL training. What people tell me is that it's not quite like zero gravity in ways that are sort of hard to quantify. And so what happens all the time is the on-orbit experience of either spacecraft or people is folded back into that training regime to make it as good as it can be. And so there are differences. There are always going to be differences. But generally speaking, I think the other thing that I hear a lot of astronauts say is that there's an adjustment period after you get up there. But after, say, a month on orbit, a crew person more or less sort of knows how things work. And so it's not bad, but it's not perfect. And the same thing goes for the performance of the hardware, right? You send a spacecraft to a place it's never been before. Well, for science, that's exactly what you want to do. For engineers, it's terrifying. It's like, what do we do, right? How do we keep it safe there? We don't know anything about how that's going to work. But this is the natural tension that we have when we do this kind of work.
So the follow-up question is that, like you said, the astronauts want to know what to do next. Is this easily determinable in the actual environment? Like what we should be doing next? So the usual reason why the crew want to know what to do next for the International Space Station is because they're pretty oversubscribed. And I've heard a lot of people talk about some hypothetical future Mars mission where half the people you talk to say the crew's going to be totally oversubscribed and they're not going to have any time and they're going to need to be scheduled to the nines. And then the other half of the people say, this is ridiculous, we don't know what to do. They're going to be bored silly, right? We need to give them things to do to keep them from going stir crazy.
I don't think anybody really knows for a Mars mission what the story is going to be. For the lunar missions of the not too distant future, those are going to be much more like space shuttle missions, where we imagine the crew is going to go to their spacecraft for, say, a month, and then they're going to come home again. So they'll probably be very busy. And so I think, for the not too distant future, the reason why we need to keep them understanding what to do next in response to any situation is merely one of, we just can't have them wasting time. So with respect to how realistic is it for them to know what to do next, if it's a systems problem, so for instance, if there's a power systems failure, or if there's a fire or something like that, usually those responses will be thought of up front, and there'll be a pretty clear indication of what to do. If a piece of equipment malfunctions, usually somebody will have a, well, try this next, try this next, try this next. So for the most part, we'll have a pretty good idea of what to tell them. At a certain point, though, the answer is always going to be, you're in a safe state, let the ground take care of it, go do whatever tasks you have left to do that you're able to do given whatever happened to you.
Okay, so we are about 15 minutes, and I'm sure you're seeing the refreshments. So Jeremy will still be here. We're going to talk to him during the refreshments. Let's thank him again for a very nice talk.